The bird will work.
Sometimes the bird doesn't work.
Yes.
Welcome to the Soma podcast. I'm Mark.
And I'm Paul. Now that we've deconstructed our evangelical beliefs,
We're trying to find a way forward to hold on to Christian faith and community.
in a post-Christian culture. You know, our listeners in our last episode might have noticed a significant boost in our audio quality, my friend.
And a significant deduction in our bank accounts.
It's actually quite amazing that our wives kind of seem supportive.
I got the green light. When I get an obsession, that I start going with that obsession, and usually involves spending some money at some point, right?
Right. So just in case people haven't figured it out, yep, you guessed it. We spent some money. We bought some equipment. Maybe you spent more than I did. I feel kind of bad about that.
No, I don't feel bad about that. This one seemed the best to me, and I justified it by saying that I will also record my son playing piano.
Oh, nice. Good. Okay. Well, in our last episode, we talked about the hero's journey, and there's so much to unpack in the hero's journey, and I think it's something that we would probably touch on here again and again. But there's something that you touched on in the last episode related to the hero's journey that I think we could pick up today, and that is
the idea of the outsider as part of an integral part of the story, that the individual has to leave their known environment, their known home, and cultural experience in order to go out and learn something new that will benefit the community.
Yeah, absolutely. So they become an outsider. They leave behind their hometown, friends, family. I think of Lord of the Rings, where Sam and Frodo leave the Shire. And there's this one point where Sam says, he stops and they're like, what's going on? He's like, one more step. And this is the part
What a fantastic line, right?
Yeah.
And there's like a point of departure where once you cross that line, you can no longer turn back.
You see this in a lot of movies, a lot of stories. I think of Bug's Life. That first comes to mind just because my kids were growing up at the time when a lot of those Pixar movies came out. That's a classic one.
Yeah, the bug. I can't remember the character's name, but in the Bug's Life, he falls in love with the princess, and but he's just a nobody. He feels insignificant, and ends up having to leave the community. And in the course of that, has an adventure, has a spiritual adventure, you might say.
Right.
And
his name was Flick. I remember.
Flick, you got it, Flick. Yeah, and then he recruits, I think, a series of circus performers or various kinds of bugs.
Yep.
And they go back to essentially save the community.
Yeah, that's right. I think Flick originally causes the trouble because he's kind of an inventor and he thinks outside the box, and the entire ant community is so conservative and risk averse. But one of his inventions kind of kickstarts a cataclysmic event, and they lose the harvest.
Right, exactly.
Right, and the grasshoppers come, and this sets the whole story in motion.
He's trying to be helpful,
yes,
but he doesn't quite know where he fits or how he fits.
Yeah, I just remember watching those movies so much because your kids just want to watch it again and again and again. Even to this day, like my wife and I will quote lines from these old movies and even Bug's Life. Every time I have a cockamamie idea, I'm like, the bird will work.
Sometimes the bird doesn't work.
Yes. This kind of reminds me a bit of our first episode, because in our first episode, we talked about you and I leaving behind the world we were a part of, and then kind of accidentally hooking up with a bunch of other people. We called this group Soma, and we've been meeting with for 7 years. And it kind of feels like that, where I felt like an outsider, you felt like an outsider. Everyone who sort of met that first time, and then we've continued, has sort of felt that. In fact, for a while there, I think we were called the Outsiders.
Yeah, we just sort of fell on that name because it was a group of people who were either not going to church very actively or questioning whether they should go to church very often and being somewhat disgruntled about it, not fitting in. We've talked about some of our journey out of the church, and for me, we've gone through many different kinds of churches over the years, and you sit there for a while and you listen for a while, but there's some kind of a disconnection that comes, and you just think, I could keep sitting here, I could keep listening, but there's something missing, and you start to question some of the ways things are presented. I find often people question the music. They become just kind of annoyed with some of the way it's done, right? And I think that's because that part of leaving is a cultural shift. Yeah. And once you start to experience that cultural shift, you find it harder to stay in, in that place, in that community, because you realize that you're kind of moving it into a different headspace.
Yeah, and it's internal for sure. Like you definitely feel like an outsider, but then you definitely get external cues. Like people around you are starting to treat you like an outsider,
Right.
And often it can come down to things you believe or just things you're questioning. I mean, our second episode about hell. I mean, that kind of puts you on the heretic watch list if you question something like that. But it continued for us, right? Like we deconstructed a lot of ideas, and this podcast isn't primarily about the deconstruction of our faith, but I think it will pop up from time.
It's inescapable, but I do think there are lots of people who will listen who are themselves going through deconstruction.
Yeah.
And what do we mean by deconstruction? Essentially moving from one place to another in your expression of faith. And there is a degree to which that is cultural, right? All churches are cultural places, like there's in the New Testament it talks about the wineskin. Nobody wants the new wine once they've tasted the old wine,
Right.
It's a metaphor for a system, a container.
Yeah.
And churches are in a sense containers. They're not simply a place where you go to listen to music or hear someone preach. They're also a cultural container.
Yeah.
And the people that gather there have a shared expression. And when you're moving away from that, you start noticing and wanting to ask questions or experiences, you're wondering how things will fit. There's one of my favorite scriptures in the New Testament. It says, "In my Father's house is many rooms. If that were not so, I would have told you. But I'm going there to prepare a place for you." And so it's John 14:2. And I had that scripture on my mind on and off for years. And, so the traditional way of thinking about it, that is after you die, you go to heaven, and up there somewhere, Jesus has been framing up some rooms. Now you get your room, right?
Right.
And then referring to that horizontal way of reading it that we've talked about.
Right.
I think the context is Jesus is speaking to the disciples who are asking Jesus, we know about the synagogue, we know about the temple, we know how the whole religious system works here and now, but we don't understand where we fit.
Right.
And so I think from a horizontal perspective, Jesus is saying, I'm preparing a place for you in the culture, in the here and now. It's not something that's going to happen after you die. Again, it's like you see the whole world defined by synagogue, and all of Jerusalem and Israel is centered in this this religious system, but I'm creating something new. And so I wonder, is that possible again? We have a sort of a church system that people know about and have their opinions about, and there's various flavors and types.
Yeah.
But is God doing something by having people, many people have left it, outsiders become outsiders? Is that a part of something God is doing?
Yeah, I think so. It's interesting, again, that you take that particular verse, and you sort of look at it with a horizontal lens, because that would have been a part of the group of verses for me that I would have put together to construct this sort of gospel, classic kind of evangelical gospel message. Like I remember using that exact verse. And also later on, Jesus talks about, I'm the way, the truth, and the life, and no one can come to the Father except through me. And that would have been a very, very consistent use of that verse. You mix that with John 3:16, you mix that with a few verses in Romans, and you put together this great vertical view of salvation, right? And like basically, again, I think I want to maybe take a second to talk about how maybe our views have changed. A classic evangelical view there would be a real emphasis on the conversion experience. And it's funny that we actually talked about our quote unquote conversion experience this last episode, but that would be like a moment in time where we would literally say, that's when I got saved. Like the day before I was lost, going to hell.
It's the turning point.
The day after I'm now going to heaven, and it's about heaven, and it's about the verticalness of it. And here you are taking one of those famous verses we would have used for the vertical message and applying it to something horizontal. And the thing is, now that I think about it, that is one of the things that started to topple my faith construction, right? Was that I had taken all of these verses kind of out of context, just a bit here, a bit there, a bit there.
Cut and paste.
And paste. Didn't really think about what the context culturally or historically or even literary was around it. And you kind of put together this message, and you really emphasize that, you know, we are saved by grace through faith, which is a strong evangelical emphasis from Paul's teaching.
Absolutely.
But like faith, what is that? And I think we would have, or I would have had thought of that more like just believing the certain list of things, right? Yeah. So like Jesus said,
Your statement of faith, you got to have these set things on there, and
Yeah.
it's either a yes or a no. It's a litmus test.
right. And you're kind of in or out based on whether you say you believe those things. You don't even have to be a nice person, but if you believe those things, you're in. And like Jesus said something like, you will know them by their fruits. But it's more like with evangelicals, you will know them by their statement of faith, right?
That's a huge one, right?
Yeah.
And I took a theology course where I had to make a statement of faith, and it's a very artificial way of generating your belief system. Because I think, in truth, my belief system and my experience with God are all interwoven together. I've studied the Bible enough for years, but it's the things that have clicked where I feel like God has shown me something. And the reason I brought up that verse about in my Father's house of many rooms, because I struggled a lot even early on as a Christian. One of the first things I felt like I thought God was saying to me was, you need to go and be part of the church.
Yeah.
And it was like, you know, can't I just be a Christian and not be a part of the church?
Yeah.
And Alex and I were fairly newly married, new Christians, I guess, and we went to all these different churches. We were in Vancouver at the time, and you know, the Pentecostal church where they pray for you and people fall down, and the church where it's just so boring that you feel like you're going to fall into a coma. There's all these different churches that we went to, and we were sort of looking for that place. And in the end, we ended up in Winnipeg at a church in Winnipeg. But still, I was always struggling with, okay, I'm connected to a group of people that feels and looks and thinks differently than any people I see on a Sunday morning. And so I remember bringing one Monday morning all of these friends of my brother and connections, and every single person was dressed in black, you know, black hair, black outfits, you know, jewelry on, Gothic jewelry. We're all sitting there an entire row in the church, you know, and it's like, and that kind of defines the beginning of a lot of my journey. Has been, how do I connect my cultural experience and background, my need to belong, with something that feels different, sounds different, doesn't always fit who I am, you know.
So you've been kind of an outsider since the beginning.
I think it's, you know, and honestly, I think it's something I've struggled with my whole life. It goes back to coming to Canada at 13 and just feeling different. You know, my first day of school when I was in Canada, I wore my school uniform to school, you know, and why I did that, I don't know. I guess it was normalcy to me.
Right.
But I had entered into a new environment, a new culture. And so I've struggled with that on and off in my life, and it's probably all part and parcel of becoming a Christian. So once I did become a Christian, I looked around and I looked for people like me that I could connect with, and because it's not enough to just go to a church. I think you're also looking for people who speak the same language as you.
Yeah.
And if you go to a church and they sound different, you know, they act different, they dress different, it's alienating.
Yeah. So I can see why John 14 would be meaningful to you, right? He's saying that I'm going to prepare a place for you. There's a place for you in this family, in this house,
Right?
And I think that a part of that is you know, meeting people who are also on that journey, right, and catching up with each other. And again, that gets us back to that hero's journey of, you leave behind the world, you become an outsider, the world you knew, the ordinary world, you become an outsider, and then along this path, you start to meet other outsiders.
Right. And it's a process of identity change. So being an outsider and trying to find that place where God is moving you and putting you is part of the spiritual journey that I believe everybody's on at some level. But we know, and I know personally, many people who grew up in the church or participated in the church or in different ways, you know, the ministry that we had started called the Red Herring, but a good chunk of them gave up along the way, you know, changed their, you know, were not able to make their faith work with the wider culture. And so you kind of are faced with a choice. You could stay in the church, but it's small and it feels culturally disconnected from the rest of your life. Or you can just go with your friendship circle in the world and process on your back burner of your mind, how does my faith still operate? But it's not integrated meaningfully, and it's tough to integrate.
When I realized that we were going to talk about the outsiders, I wanted to really tell a story from Jesus's life, from his hero's journey, and it was early in the narrative. And it's the story where Jesus becomes an outsider, like literally overnight, where he's in his hometown, he's with his family, his friends, everyone he grew up with, and then something happens, and they get so angry and so full of rage, they push him out and they want to throw him off a cliff. Like they literally want to kill him. And it's so weird, but it's so fascinating. But there's a lot of parallels, I think, in this story to maybe our experience and others who might be listening. So what could Jesus possibly do or say that would cause like uncles and aunts and people he grew up with to want to kill him? And it came down to something that he said in church one day. It's pretty interesting. It's basically he read the Bible differently than everyone else, and it triggered an incredible reaction. So I want to just quickly tell the story. It's found in Luke chapter 4, and Jesus is attending synagogue on the Sabbath day, and he stands up to read. And they hand him a scroll, a book, and it's the book of Isaiah. And he opens up to a particular verse in Isaiah. It's Isaiah 61. And I'm not going to go into like the background on this verse because it would take too much time. But basically, like Isaiah 61 was a very popular, it was a very famous, inspiring, comforting verse for the people of Israel and for the people in Jesus' day, right? It's like it would be like our John 3:16 or something like that.
Yeah.
And it was everyone's favorite passage. And basically, when you're under a foreign Gentile power that's controlling your life, this is the verse you cling to. It's Isaiah 61.
Right.
Originally, in Isaiah's day, it was about the Babylonians who had brought the inhabitants of Jerusalem over to exile and destroyed their city. But in Jesus' day, obviously, that Gentile power was Rome, right? And so Jesus picks up this passage, and everyone thinks they know what it means, and everyone has incredible hope and expectation in this verse. And I'm going to read it just so I don't mess it up. This is what he says. He reads from Isaiah, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, and to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord." And then he closes the book and he gives it back to the attendant. What's interesting about it is he actually stops mid-verse and he doesn't quote it fully, which is really strange.
He leaves off, some of the more harsher stuff.
Yeah, like there's a whole part about the day of the vengeance of our God. So to the people listening to Jesus, it was like healing the brokenhearted and giving freedom to captives and sight to the blind. Their interpretation was, this is what this Holy One, this Messiah, is going to do for us Jews, us Israelites. And then
there was an us and them in there.
There was an us and them.
This is all good news for us and bad news for everybody else.
And for everyone else, for that Gentile power, it was the day of vengeance. But it's interesting that Jesus doesn't actually, he stops there. He doesn't quote that one. So then Jesus says something quite amazing. He goes, "Today this verse is fulfilled in your hearing, right?"
All right.
And they listen to him. I mean, that's quite a statement. He's literally saying this is going to come true today. Like, what? Rome is going to fall? What? Are you, Jesus, saying you're this anointed one that's going to do this? But they're not mad at him. They're actually marveling. There's actually a phrase that says they start to marvel at his gracious words. And they were like, "Isn't this Joseph's boy? Like, wow, what's he saying? How did he get to know all this stuff?" But then, so everything's going good, but then something happens. Jesus says something and the whole thing turns around. It goes south. He says something so insulting, so scandalizing, that people literally want to kill him. And he instantly becomes an outsider that day. And so he goes on and he talks about widows, lepers, and Gentiles. And I think from us reading from the 21st century, like we're like, I'm not sure why they're getting so mad about this. But he says something like, there were a lot of widows in the days of Elijah that were in Israel, Jewish ones. But it was a Gentile widow that Elijah went to. And then it was like, there's a lot of lepers in the days of Elisha, but he cleaned and he cleansed and healed Naaman, who was a Syrian, a Gentile.
Right.
And when they heard this, they literally got up, they pushed him out of the city, and they tried to throw him off a cliff, and it didn't take. So Jesus takes this favorite passage, and they understood this to be that the Messiah was going to save and heal and free them while giving vengeance and violence to their Gentile overlords.
Right.
But instead, Jesus says, I'm coming for outsiders. He says, I'm coming for vulnerable women, widows, lepers, and especially Gentiles. And this so confronted deep-rooted pain, maybe, just racism, religious intolerance, whatever it was, that they were literally enraged to the point of killing Joseph's kid, and they pushed him out of the city.
Well, I mean, I think ultimately the thing that that threatens Jesus and the thing that leads to his crucifixion is, he is challenging the religious system, right? So when he's saying, in my Father's house are many rooms, it is a challenge to the synagogue. The same thing with, the cleansing of the temple. He's cleansing the outer court of the temple, which is intended, one of its intentions was the outer court of the Gentiles. So it's essentially saying you've turned the outer court, a place that should be to meet God and worship God, into a place where you're making money. And it's undermining the purpose of the temple. So many stories, the Good Samaritan, an outsider,
It's true. Like, he collects outsiders along the way. Like, he literally starts to walk out this verse,
right.
and along the way, a band of outsiders start to form around him, and he ultimately does get crucified by the company because of the company he kept. It wasn't really anything but the fact that they couldn't get over the fact that he would, touch lepers or hang out with prostitutes or accept tax collectors. Like, these are all people that they would consider sinful. They would have considered, you don't hang out with these people. And he was eating with them and he was accepting them. And that was super radical. It was super political. It was super revolutionary. And we really miss that sometimes when we read back into it. Of course, maybe the vertical is a standard way we go, Mark, because maybe it takes too much time or effort to really look at the horizontal. But there's something powerful going on here with this group of outsiders.
Well, I think today there's I think it was a philosopher, René Girard, said he essentially became a Christian because he recognized in the victim narrative a truth that was greater, so that the victim has, like the Good Samaritan and, these stories are telling of the woman at the well, they connect with Jesus on a level. It says, like the tax collectors and prostitutes enter into the kingdom before the good Pharisees,
Right.
So in other words, they have a shortcut to what God is doing. Well, that's going to make you mad if your whole system is built on you being right and you being first. We do have a church system that feels a little fossilized at times to many people, and it is easy to kind of beat up and say, look, they're the Pharisees because now they don't recognize these new views, these new ideas. So we need to be careful. I just want to provide some balance there. But I do think God is doing something in the church in that it's the same thing he's always been doing. Essentially, is getting us to recognize that people that don't fit in the wineskin and don't fit in the framework, and he's still creating something new. And maybe, we've seen the church decline since the 1960s and the Cultural Revolution incredibly, and many, many people have given up trying to make their faith fit with the existing institution and cultures. But I think the good news is that shows that God is, I believe, a new wineskin is coming, something new is happening. Yeah. And and people who are struggling, to encourage them not to give up on your faith, but to recognize that being the outsider and having that experience is a part of the spiritual journey that God is taking many people on.
It seems today more than ever, people are still drawing these lines, like you say, like that there's that us and them sort of dualism that's going on.
Right.
And it's easy to point that out in religious circles, but it seems like it's human nature. Like it's human nature to feel pious and to say, I have the truth and it's us. If you believe these things, you're on my side. And if you don't believe these things, you're one of them.
Right,
and I'm seeing the same thing in secular culture with atheists, with the right, with the left. It's like we referenced the other day Nietzsche talking about God is dead, and he was seeing the decline of a belief in Christianity in the culture. But it's like people are just replacing religion with something else, and it's still, at the end of the day, it's aggressive. It's kind of violent. It's kind of like, if you don't talk the way I talk, then you're kind of the enemy. It's kind of the way that Jesus was treated by his family, and it doesn't even have to be over religious things. It's still there. And I think what our society might want to consider is that, at least with the Judaic Christian sort of roots that we have, it's an old religion. It's an old idea, and at least what's rooted in Jesus is that there's something about like love, and there's something about forgiving people, and there's something about like loving your enemies, right? And
yeah, those are deep truths that are very hard to do, because I also say that in some ways it's not about religion. It's about how the human spirit functions, because you can read the Bible, and that was the problem the Pharisees had, right? You can read the Bible and you can know the verses, but it doesn't produce any grace in your heart towards other people. It makes you legalistic and harsh, and because you have that legalistic rule-based mindset, that and that's some of the things that I think whenever you get a group of people together, it becomes kind of a formalized group or church or community. There is a tendency over time for that, these are the rules, this is our list of what is acceptable and what we don't tolerate. And so the gift of the outsider is to see things differently, to have an invention that doesn't work, to have, a way of making music that doesn't fit in, to to just see and do things differently. And so there's a value in that, because it can help the community become less brittle.
Yeah.
In the reverse sense too, that individual usually has to suffer and usually has to go on a journey,
right,
so that they gain the humility and the ability to be able to present those advantages or those truths back to the community.
Right, because you're right. That's the hero's journey. They leave the community, but at some point in the story, they come back and they bring what they have learned they come back to that community and to bring great help and salvation. And even with Bug's life, Flick, his cockamamie bird idea actually does save the entire colony.
What cultures are good at, what groups are good at, is protecting individuals, right? And people are wired up to be. Most people are wired up to be group oriented. I do this thing in my classroom when I do hand-in folders, and I make projects and kids have to hand them in, and I've noticed over the years that, let's say I make a hand-in folder for the book cover, and I'll get 15 kids will hand it in on time. And then I've got 5 kids who didn't hand it in. So I have to have a way of communicating to the 5 kids, because what will happen is, if I make a folder that says marked and I put the 15 that are marked in there, the other 5 kids will follow the group and put them all in the marked folder. And I'll say, well, it doesn't not make sense to you. I'll have to explain to them, that means I've marked it. Well, why did you go one step beyond just the folder and put it in with because everybody else was in there.
Right.
And it sounds kind of ludicrous, but I've noticed it over and over again, is that people behave as a group. They figure out what the norms are, they figure out what the practices are in your classroom, and most people go along with it. And that's the strength of a culture, until you need to make a change.
Right.
Or somebody has a change that's better, and then the group resists it.
So we need outsiders to kind of pull society along, right? Like take the next step in our evolution and our progress.
And I think that's a theme throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament. So one of the thoughts I've had about the group and about the individual who is the outsider, I connected with Hebrews 13:12. It says, "And so Jesus also suffered outside the city gate to make the people holy through his own blood." And it says, I think, without the gate. So in other words, in the ancient world, the gate was a very necessary protection against people who might come to burn down your home or steal your stuff or whatever. Right. It's a more tend to be more violent place. So Jesus is essentially being crucified outside the city camp. So and there's a disgrace in that because it means you're outside the protection of the community.
Wow!
But it's that outsideness and that lack of protection that is necessary for the salvation-changing reality to happen, because something happens when an individual who exists as an outsider and goes off and suffers and does something that gains them an insight, gains them an ability, that then they willingly go back and help the community. In a very small sense, if you've ever had a marriage problem, you get a counselor, right? Mm-hmm. Usually the best counselors have also had problems. They've also suffered or gone through difficult times, and then that gives them the ability to then help you but you need someone from outside your family system, outside of your community structure sometimes to come in to be able to provide that insight, that salvation, whether it be a small salvation or be, salvation through Christ. God needs to send someone first out to be able to learn and understand and have that realization, and then often sends back into the community to provide what has been developed and grown through that suffering and that experience.
Yeah, that protection is super interesting. It reminds me of what I brought up in our first episode when I actually left the church. I published this book, and it was sort of my goodbye, my farewell.
Right.
And then I had people tell me, this is dangerous. If you leave, you're going to fall. It's
dangerous. Yeah, it is dangerous.
Yeah, and because you're basically leaving the protected gate of our community, right? And we can't protect you. You're in trouble if you leave the city. But yet I needed to go on this journey to get that thing that I could never get if I stayed back behind the walls.
And I think that is actually a part of how God works through spiritual growth. Like we tend to read scripture sometimes as kind of these little fossilized things, and I think our challenge is to try to apply them to our lives and see how the patterns that are in scripture are the same spiritual patterns that are happening to us. Yeah. And that God works essentially, I think, the same way all the time. He's always got some scheme that he's working to grow us, to teach us. And some, I think God does call certain individuals to be those outsiders, to be individuals who go on ahead and sometimes suffer, sometimes have to overcome incredible obstacles because it's a part of the spiritual journey. You think of, Moses. Moses was really had the best position in the house in Egypt, ends up having to leave and go and tend sheep for years and years and years before he could come back and then be the mouthpiece to help free, the slaves in Egypt. You think of Joseph and his brothers throw him in a pit, and he ends up going into Egypt, and Egypt being a symbol of a system that is cruel and oppressive. Yeah. And he rises to the top in that system so that at the right moment, at the right time, he's able to help his brothers and family. So there's always that individual who God has on a trajectory, and he's preparing them to provide something that is necessary, that salvation for the group. The challenge is you can have faith-based, you can have experiences in life that tell you things and that give you meaning, but having knowledge of the scriptures provides insight that can help speed up your learning and speed up your ability to put things right in your life and grow spiritually. Mm-hmm. I think that what we're trying to do with this podcast is provide a little bit of that outside voice. We've been on a journey. We've been processing a lot of these things. In a sense, we've left and we've been outside the camp, and but we haven't given up trying to connect with God and connect with Jesus. And we're trying to now share what it is we've learned and how we've managed to continue in our faith.
Yeah, I think of the exile we referenced earlier from, the Isaiah 61 passage Jesus read from. He would have been writing at the time of the exile. And, all of these people are captured. Whoever survives is dragged to Babylon, and their city and their temple is destroyed. And they live in Babylon for the next 70 years.
Right.
And they literally live there under a foreign culture that doesn't know their culture, doesn't know their traditions, doesn't know their scriptures. There's no more temple. There's no more system. And they have to find a way to find faith, to move forward in this foreign culture with none of the props that they had before. And I kind of think that's a very good illustration or metaphor for what's happening today.
It's like you're going to go deep, and you're going to start seeking, you're going to start digging, because if it's not working and your foundation is not supporting you any longer, you need something more. And that's been my personal experience. I made a conscious decision just to keep seeking God. Mm-hmm. And even though I was extremely unhappy in my life at one point, and I just felt like God had kind of abandoned me in many ways, but I just said, well, I'm going to keep praying, I'm going to keep seeking God. And now what I've realized is that's kind of how the whole thing works, that God deliberately brings you through these seasons of leaving, departure, leaving home, and that he has a purpose in it, and he has a plan in it. And that's, I do believe that we're trying to speak to some of these outsiders that may be listening, mm-hmm. is that God has a plan for you, and God has a purpose in your sense of disconnection. It's not by accident. Mm-hmm. It's not because you're a bad person or you didn't read your Bible enough or any of those things. Mm-hmm. It's something God is doing in our culture, and he's inviting people, and he's looking for people to keep persisting, keep reaching out, keep seeking and making that connection, because I do think a new thing is coming, a new way of expressing faith, a new way of connecting with to Jesus that doesn't throw everything away, mm-hmm. but is present and takes into consideration the culture that we're part of now.
Yeah, I agree, Mark. And those outsiders out there that are listening, maybe some of you are like me or have been like me. And I've referenced this a few times so far in our podcast. I definitely came to points where I didn't know I didn't think there was a God, or if there is a God, it's maybe God isn't personal or some kind of force or something, because I just didn't make sense in the world anymore. But I want to encourage you to stop and maybe think about your future, about how you want to live the rest of your life, and maybe there is a way to rediscover faith and rediscover God and rediscover Christ that would look nothing like maybe what you once knew, but it's a way forward, because there's so much there. There's so much depth. There's so much history. There's a lot of value there, and I would be really reluctant to just throw it all away. All right, until next time.